You're asking a philosophical question that the same thing gets perceived differently. No, I agree, but you know, I would just relate it to the question, policy changes, there are these kinds of just hard thinking, and there is a certain amount of scientific power to economics which can be used. But I thought when you were giving the light heat example, you're talking of something which I'm talking about, social norms which promote growth like honesty, integrity. How can you change those? There I have to plead ignorance. I really don't know. I know that there is a strong relationship between social norms of integrity, in particular trustworthiness and growth. There are studies which begin to show that. How do you generate integrity, honesty, trustworthiness? I don't know, but I feel even if you don't know the answer as to how you change those things, it's at least important to recognize that there is a link between economic variables and social and cultural and normative variables. And that's really what I was stressing.
Sir, I was also referring to the financial reforms that came, you know, in response to the crisis that we felt in 91.
In which year?
In 1991, when we started the reform process, it was obviously because of the crisis.
Yes.
So I was also referring to that.
But there was not too much of financial reform really. The 1991 reforms were mainly in the international sector. There were two major things. There was de-licensing. July 1991, in fact July 24th, I happen to remember that very well, was the major industrial de-licensing was announced. That was Chidambaram, Commerce Minister, and Finance Minister Manmohan Singh announced a set of really international sector reform. One of the biggest reforms, which is very curious, I still remember a sentence in his budget speech saying that India had become so closed an economy, we were raising the tariff rates. So there was a statement saying that we will lower the ceiling of the tariff to 150%. Now lowering to 150%, very few countries can do. Countries can raise it to 150, it just shows where we had gone, that we had to talk in terms of lowering that. So the reforms were really not in the financial sector as much. That's happening more recently. It was in the international sector, it was in the industrial sector. And we've seen the effect of that. In the industrial sector, we haven't seen that much effect, frankly. But in the international sector, the effect has been dramatic. India's foreign exchange balance reserves in 1977 was $5 billion with the Reserve Bank of India. In 1990, it was $5 billion. It had gone up once a little, it had come down. $5 billion we had stayed from 1977 to 1990. 1993, it began to increase from 5, 10, 20, 25, now it's 385 or 300. So it's an exponential rise in that. India's exports and imports still relatively low by the standards of many of our competing countries. If you take export plus import as a fraction of GDP, India's figure is 46%, China's is 76%. But 46% is more than double what it was in 1991. So the reforms in the sectors where they took place, we've seen big changes. I feel now, and I know that's not what you're asking, but I feel now we need the big reforms of the kind that we saw in 1991 in our social welfare system, delivery mechanism. That's going to affect the poor, and through that, that's going to affect the growth rate once again.
Thank you.
Professor Sengupta from University of Lucknow. You have given very enlightening views on the fiscal reforms, and you said that on the fiscal front, we are very comfortable. I have two important observations. That during the 10th and 11th five-year plan, the basic focus is on the system of resource mobilization. And as far as the system of resource mobilization is concerned, the most important factor is the balance from current revenue as a ratio to national income at current prices.
Give me what ratio?
Balance from current revenue as a ratio to national income at current prices. So when we talk about balance from current revenue as a ratio to national income at current prices, this means tax rate, tax revenue as a ratio to national income at current prices minus non-planned consumption expenditure as a ratio to your national income at current prices. So undoubtedly the government of India has made laudable efforts in order to increase the tax GDP ratio. And if I am not mistaken, the figures are like this, that if we take the composite position of the state government and the central government, the tax GDP ratio has increased from 9% to 12% to 15%, whereas in the developed countries, it ranges between 30 to 40%. So on the tax front, there is a saturation point because ultimately it depends upon, it is organically connected with the level of productivity. On the side of expenditure, particularly the non-plan expenditure, everybody knows what are the figures of the cost of election, you know, for the Lok Sabha. In 1996, the cost of election was 2,200 crores. In election in 2004-5, it was 3,200 crores. And in 2009, the cost of election stands at 10,000 crores. So seeing these figures and considering the nature of non-plan, non-developmental, semi-contractual expenditure, my question is, what are your suggestions for the effective management of public expenditure, particularly in the domain of non-plan expenditure? The second important observation is that there is a dichotomy, and as a student of fiscal economics, we are in a dichotomous position because when there was an economic reforms program, at that particular point of time, the Secretary of Finance, Montek Singh Ahluwalia, said that, you see, fiscal deficit GDP ratio is responsible and it is attributable to the high rate of inflation. Fiscal deficit GDP ratio is again responsible for creating deficit in the current account of the balance of payments. So at that time, the Ministry, NADLA, Department of Economic Affairs, used to pronounce that it is the fiscal deficit which is the villain of the piece. But subsequently, in 2000-2001, the same ministry is saying that fiscal deficit is not our problem because we have adequate amount of foreign exchange reserves. My question is there any one-to-one correspondence between fiscal deficit GDP ratio and the rate of inflation? One. And two is there any empirical evidence between the fiscal deficit GDP ratio and the rate of inflation? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your first question, I mean, it's really an easy answer about the ultimate target that we do want to control non-plan expenditure. It's huge, and especially if you're talking of the election expenditure waste, of course you want to control. But from the point of view of the fiscal calculations, 10,000 crores, yes, it's money that you want to stop, but the food subsidy bill is 55,000 crores. Fertilizer subsidy bill is more than 50,000 crores. 2 years ago, it had gone up to 80,000 crores. Fuel subsidy is 150,000 crores. So there are mega expenditures taking place, subsidizing a variety of products. So morally, I think it's important to clean up the election expenditure. But purely from a fiscal point of view, a small improvement in any of these expenditures, which a lot of it is being frittered away, is going to really transform the nature of the fiscal deficit, and that's what I was stressing in the main lecture. Your question about the relationship between fiscal deficit, I mean, I can't address about other people's views having changed or consistency over time, but I can tell you what my views are. The fiscal deficit is, the fiscal deficit is a very odd instrument. It's the best analogy you can use is it's like an antibiotic. When a economic downturn comes, it's an old view from John Maynard Keynes that you increase your fiscal deficit. What happens when a depression, this is the sort of standard view, and this is still not beyond controversy. When a downturn comes in an economy, there is a shortage of demand. Companies have gone cautious, they are not spending enough money, people are not spending enough money. So the belief is, coming from John Maynard Keynes, that you step up government expenditure, deficit goes up, but the government is filling in for ordinary people by creating demand for products. So, and that's what you saw happened in India over the last 2 years. The fiscal deficit was expanded deliberately. So it was a plan to take these Keynesian measures. But there is a risk. You continue with this for too long, with a large fiscal deficit, you're injecting demand into the economy, you begin to give a boost to inflation. So the inflation worry is indeed there if you continue with the fiscal deficit for too long. However, the problem is when there is an economic downturn, you can't even say, I'm not going to increase fiscal deficit, because that's an instrument you're using to get the economy bouncing back again and the growth bouncing back. So it's a very tight-rope act. You need fiscal deficit to pull the economy and the growth rate, the real economy, employment up. But if you use it for too long, you're going to inject too much demand into the economy, and that's going to push up prices. What the government is trying is to balance these two, and the term that you will hear that is being talked about is calibrated rollback of the fiscal deficit. Yes, it has been made large, but we don't want to continue with it for too long, and for reasons that it could fuel inflation. Reserve Bank of India has also taken economy